Welcome to C100 Global Wisdom Talks, the podcast where we explore transformative ideas and practical strategies for entrepreneurial families navigating the complex worlds of family wealth, family offices, and governance. Danny Kurtesh and Jan Petka are your guides on this journey as we uncover insights from the world's most brilliant minds and thought leaders shaping the future of intergenerational success. Before we dive in, let me introduce C100 Global, a peer network for entrepreneurial families and families of wealth. Our mission is to empower families to build meaningful legacies and become thriving 100-year families through a focus on dynamics, governance, and strategic collaboration. And now, let's start our conversation.
Hello, everyone. Hello to number 2 of our Global Wisdom Talk series. The Global Wisdom Talk series is just a podcast series. If then we want to explore cutting-edge ideas, strategies in regards of families, family wealth, and family offices. I'm Jan Petka. I'm the co-founder of C100 Global.
And I'm Danny Curtis. I'm also the co-founder of C100 Global. I'm thrilled to introduce our guest today, Philip Marcovici. Philip is a pioneering lawyer and a globally recognized expert in family wealth management, family governance, and tax law. He worked extensively with entrepreneurial family and advised them on navigating complexities around wealth, business, and legacy.
So, Philip, welcome. It's our pleasure that we have.
Happy to be with you.
Today on board. So, Philip, you are the author of 2 books. Please correct me. You are the author of this book, The Destructive Power of Family Wealth. And it is just announced that in February, you will be published your 2nd book. And it's called The Transformative Power of Family Wealth. So can you give us just a little bit overview about yourself and for our audience?
Okay, so a bit of overview of myself. First of all, I guess most importantly, given my accent, I have to say that I'm not American. I'm Canadian. I grew up in Canada and went to university in Canada, also studied law in Canada. But I then did move to the United States and also studied law in the US and started as a lawyer in New York as a corporate tax lawyer many, many years ago. I moved, however, early on in my career to Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, while I arrived there as a corporate tax lawyer, I like to say that I left Hong Kong as more of a wealth management, family business and wealth lawyer, focusing on the issues in and around those who own family businesses and family wealth. I was in Hong Kong in the 1980s practicing as a lawyer, and that was a time that Margaret Thatcher was in the process of negotiating the return of Hong Kong to China. Basically, the most capitalist place in the world, Hong Kong was in the process of being returned to the most communist place in the world. And as you can imagine, this caused among the community of business owners and wealth owners in Hong Kong a great deal of concern and a move towards planning to deal with political risk exposures. And what I found was that my work moved in those years from being work for companies to being work for the owners of companies. And I was dealing with not only tax issues, but also issues in and around how businesses and wealth should be held from a safety point of view, leading to succession and other issues. In and around 1995, after a number of years in Hong Kong, about 12 years in Hong Kong, I then relocated to Switzerland, staying with the same law firm that I was with, Baker McKenzie in those days. And I then moved to the Zurich office of Baker McKenzie, began working with families and around the world, and also with all the private banks and trust companies and other service providers in and around them. The reason I wrote my first book, The Destructive Power of Family Wealth, was that I learned very early on that wealth can be very destructive of family relationships, can be destructive of family businesses, and it really is a minority of families that navigate and are able to avoid some of these issues that arise that create the destructive nature of family wealth. I retired from practicing law about now almost close to 15 years ago. And in the last years, I've been focusing on writing and teaching and working with a few families, and focusing very much not only on how families can overcome the destructive power of family wealth, but I've also become increasingly interested in the role of wealth and business owning families in society. And how do we address, among others, inequality? How do we address the many issues that face our societies around the world? So my second book, which is coming out, as you say, in February, is called The Transformative Power of Family Wealth. So moving from, how wealth can be destructive of family relationships and family businesses, what I address is really how can family, business, and wealth transform families in a positive way, but how can this also be done in a manner that transforms our societies in a positive way? This is the theme of what I'm trying to do.
Very important point.
Could you say that your first book is more based on the, let's say, current state of advising families and families of wealth in terms of protecting them about the influence of money that a family has, and then the destructive power that money can have, and now shifting to a more positive view of what money can achieve for the family and for the society?
In a sense, yes. In a sense, yes. But I guess I'd have to be honest and say that despite that I'm now writing and speaking and teaching about how wealth owners can be part of a more positive world, I don't have the experience that wealth is a positive factor for many of the families or most of the families that I've run across and I've worked with and I've observed. The reality is we continue to be in a situation where there are great misunderstandings in society about the role and the value of wealth and business owners, and there continue to be repetitive issues that you see within families that are totally destructive, that sometimes have nothing to do with wealth. They have everything to do with mental health and relationships and many other factors that are affected by the fact the family has wealth. So my answer to your question is yes, there's a positive move from talking about the destructive power to the transformative power, but it doesn't reflect, sadly, a conclusion that somehow we're in a more positive world. If anything, the challenges for wealth and business owners who are looking to achieve what they want to achieve are greater than ever. And those challenges, maybe we'll talk about them a little bit later, are internal family challenges, business challenges, and societal challenges. Wealth and business owning families have to navigate all of them. And the reality about the destructive power of family wealth, the difficulties families run across, is very often they focus a lot more on the immediacy of their businesses, the immediacy of tax and legal changes that are happening, and they don't have the long-term view of really, where are we heading? What are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to do? And what I try to do in my second book is very much focus on that process. What are the processes that families can adopt to really get from point A to point B and identify exactly what point B is? Because for a lot of wealth and business owners, they don't really have a clear goal about what they're trying to achieve. They know they want to preserve what they have, and they know they want to pass that over to the next generation, but they have not always thought through very carefully, what does this mean over time? How do we plan to make sure that we achieve what it is we're actually shooting for?
Just a quick follow-up before we go more in the direction of these transformative changes. I mean, we all work with entrepreneurial families that have the challenge that they're seen by society and by the outside as wealthy, as people with money, as people with no problem because they have money. And this perception is sometimes something that is keeping them back in doing the right things for themselves and for their family. So coming quickly back to the destructive side of money, what would you advise these families to do first when they, maybe after a liquidity event, maybe after a big time where an enterprise has grown big and the family wealth has grown with it, that they can deal with these challenges that they're having right now, and not just from the point of let's protect the money, but let's try to protect the family.
Yeah, I think, I guess, the comments that I would have to what you're raising are to first, recognize that, wealth is an interesting psychological, issue within families and also within our societies. And it's exactly as you say, the outsider who doesn't have wealth, thinks, boy, if I had the money, I'd be really happy. And look at that other family, across the road, they're so wealthy. But wealth and being wealthy and how much wealth it takes to be wealthy is very subjective. Somebody who has 1 million thinks if you have 10, then you'd be really wealthy. The person with 10 thinks, well, 10 is nothing. You can't live on 10 million. Unless you have 100 million, it's not really meaningful. And I can tell you for sure, people who have 100 million do not feel, you may think they're wealthy, but they don't feel wealthy, because they're looking around and they see people with literally hundreds of millions who are outspending them, who are doing things that are at a different level. And of course, nowadays, if you have in the hundreds of millions, you're not even playing with the big boys. You're not in the billionaire class. So if you're not a billionaire, what's the point? You don't even have a voice in the conversation. And today, if you're a billionaire with 1 or 2 billion, you're at the absolute back of the room of billionaires. If you want to be a serious billionaire, you've got to be in a completely different category. So you see where I'm going with this. The reality is all these references that private banks often make to high net worth, ultra high net worth, ultra high net worth, ultra high net worth. These are all, for me, almost insulting terms. And a reality is, I say to any private bank, get rid of all of those terms and names, because these are subjective. These are subjective terms. We're dealing with families, we're dealing with human beings, we're dealing with families in different situations, we're dealing with first generation entrepreneurs, we're dealing with seventh generation family members, dealing with a family business that's been grown over many generations and built, reputation based on family values and otherwise. Each family is different, each family is unique, but like every family, there are full of messy situations that arise no matter how much wealth is involved. It just gets magnified when you have more wealth in the picture. Divorces, second marriages, mistresses, toy boys, political risk, taxation, all of these issues affect everybody. And they just becomes magnified when you're dealing with wealth-owning families, and the psychological barriers and issues can be really, really horrendous to deal with.
That's absolutely amazing, Philip. So can I ask you, can you give us just a little outlook, or what I've called just a little appetizer on your new book? You have probably 1 or 2 examples what you can present us and our audience today.
I think what I can do is I could put it in the context to describe to you a little bit, how the book flows and what it covers, and that will give you a sense of other areas you may want to discuss with me today. What I do in the book is first to lay out some examples of families at different levels of wealth and different levels of complexity. And I do this in order to lay the groundwork for saying the planning approach can be similar, but will be, of course, different depending on what the family is looking to achieve and otherwise. So I move from a family where there are a few $100,000 of wealth, and there's a family home involved, and there is a succession that is going to have to be planned for, as it has to be planned for every family. I then have some examples of families where there's a family business that's been around for generations, and we want to transition the family business. I also talk about the example of a family where the business has been sold, and we're talking about significant wealth, liquid assets, but a desire to encourage entrepreneurship in the younger generation so that the family could re-enter as a business owning family into the future. And then I also give as an example a country that is looking to benefit from attracting wealth and business owners to their economy. And so I give that example as well. And I give that example a little bit tongue-in-cheek, looking at the United Kingdom, England, and the mess that it's made in terms of its policies regarding wealth and business owning families. What I then do is I move into considering a methodology for everyone to take, whether it's a family or a country, a methodology in planning that I learned about in some of my teaching at Cambridge University, something called the theory of change, which is used very much in sustainability project. And this theory of change for me is a very interesting methodology in planning, because what it does, to put it in a very simple way, is it starts at the end, not at the beginning. So what does that mean? It means that in the planning, what a family, if we're talking about a family, can do is they can say to themselves, let's choose a date in the future and let's start discussing what success would look like on that date if we planned everything really well. Now, that date in the future already is a very important part of the planning process, because how far should you plan in the future? Well, personally, myself, if I'm, in my 60s and, I have adult children and I have some wealth and I want to pass that over, maybe for me, a good thing would be to say, well, why don't I plan 20 years forward? When I'm in my 80s, what would I like to see that would make me happy that I've done my planning well? Well, what I would like to see, for example, is that my children are happy, that they're content, that they have good careers, that they're self-confident, that they're healthy, that their education and healthcare is well taken care of, that the wealth that there may be has not harmed them, has actually helped them along the way. Also, that there are safety mechanisms so that the wealth perhaps can help further generations. If it's a family in business, then perhaps the date might be a longer one. They might look 30 years or 40 years forward, or 100 years, and we'll come to that a little bit later, 500 years or 1,000 years. And then once you really discuss in detail what kind of a future success do we envision in terms of how the wealth will be used, is it going to be owned or stewarded by the younger generation? How is it going to be protected? How do we deal with divorces and all of the derailers, all the things that can go wrong for families? We then work backwards and we say, okay, where are we today? And what are the actions and steps we need to take today to build towards that future that we have planned for? And so it's really a planning process. And then in the book, what I go through is the detail within that planning process. In other words, there are a lot of things that can stop you from getting to where you want to go. Some of those things are internal to the family. You get into a big dispute in the family, or there's a mess, divorce, or whatever that happens, or it could be in the outside world, a taxing event or a political risk event or something else. But there are legal and educational and psychological steps that can be taken by a family to get around these derailers, these things that can push you off the course of getting to your ultimate goal and your destination. And I then discuss both what are the derailers, what are the things that can go wrong, but then what are the tools that can be used to get around those problems. Things like trusts and foundations and insurance structures and all of the different things that advisors will talk about. And I also go through the risks for families to over-rely on advisors. You need advisors, but it's very dangerous as well, because the world out there, everyone is full of conflicts of interest, and advisors can very often kidnap the assets of the family if the family is not really well aware of what's going on. Many, many things that I could mention, but perhaps one thing that I should really emphasize is that to avoid the destructive power of family wealth, to avoid many of the problems that families face, the one thing that is probably the most important is communication within the family, and the family itself understanding and buying into what the succession plan is. A big mistake is to keep the younger generation in the dark about what the plan actually is. A lot of it is about working with the younger generation because they're the ones who are going to make it happen, and to keep surprises only for Halloween. There should be no surprises within the family when it comes to the succession process. So in the book, I also talk about a number of other areas, including the circular economy, how families should, like companies in the manufacturing process who seek not to waste resources. That's what circular economy is really about. Let's not waste materials when we're manufacturing. I take that same concept and I talk about families. Let's not waste family members. Let's find ways of making use of family members who don't want to be directly in the family business, or who don't want to live in the same country as the business may be located. Also, let's not waste elderly family members. The whole world of changing demographics, the reality that we're all living to much longer ages is a great thing, but it does change the dynamic of succession within families, and it can give rise to wasted resources both ways. So if mom or dad, when they turn 70 and 80, remain the chairman of the company, they're running the whole thing, maybe that's good, but you're maybe wasting resources in the younger generation because you're not giving them the chance at leadership. If you kick out the older generation too early, you may be wasting resources because they are a resource. You need to think about these things and have very meaningful roles for everyone in the family, regardless of what the connection of the family is in terms of day-to-day work. Not everyone needs to be full-time involved in the family business or the family investments, but to be successful as a family of wealth or in business, every single family member has to understand their role in the structure and the potential role for their children, so that as parents, they can raise their children and encourage them to take on skills that will be helpful to what the family in the long term is trying to achieve, not only for itself, but for its employees, for its communities, and for society as a whole.
That's a great,
great Sorry, Jan, I just want to take one half sentence that you said, Philip, because I encountered this so many times. You said you want the children to be happy. I mean, I think every family wants the children to be happy. Now, how often did you encounter, especially business families, families that have still a running business, an existing business, find that the elder generation decides for the children how they can be happy, and let's make it happen for them without having the discussion with the kids. And I'm talking kids in their 30s, 40s.
Yeah, all too often. And there's just a reality that there's a huge freedom associated with not coming from a family of wealth. You know, if you're coming from a family that doesn't have wealth and you have a decent education and you make your way, you have a much easier time than somebody who's growing up in a family with a lot of money and a lot of expectations and a lot of misunderstanding about expectations. And let me just give a few examples, because I think that this would be helpful. There's so much to say in this area, but I'll give a couple of examples just so that you get a flavor of it. I mentioned the word expectations. One of the biggest issues that I run across with families and children is the mismatch of expectations that the children have versus what the parents have in mind. And I have older generation family members who say to me often, "Oh, Philip, you know, our kids don't know we have wealth. They don't know we have some dough." And I say to them, "Are you nuts? If your kid, you know, looks around, you're living in this very nice house, you have a driver taking them to school. When you go on holidays, you're staying in beautiful chalets, you're staying in the nicest hotels. If your kid goes on the internet, they see, you know, what you're doing and the work you have. If anything, your kids may think you have more money than you actually have. And they may have a wrong expectation that when they reach their 20s and 30s, that somehow some of that money is going to come their way. If that's not the plan, wouldn't it be more fair to discuss that openly with your children when they're early on in their 15, 16, in their teens, when they can still make decisions about their own education? So something that I think, some families need to do is early on, they should be saying to the kids, look, we have some wealth, there are responsibilities that come with this wealth, but in fact, none of this is coming to you guys until you're going to reach the age of 40 or 50 or 60 at the earliest. You're going to have a lot of opportunities, but your life, you've got to make for yourself. When is the right time to give that message? Do you wait until the kid is 30 and they haven't, done much in their education, and now they're just waiting and waiting for you to give, the parents to give some money? You create this relationship of dependency that is very, very unpleasant. And psychologically, there are a lot of older generation who actually like the power, or they think they like the power of controlling the money and communicating with their children using their wealth. And you find children at age 30, 40, and 50, and even 60 still just waiting and waiting and waiting to get some dough from the older generation. This mismatch of communication and expectations is a big issue within families. And if you want to create success, not only in terms of the happiness of the individuals, but you want those individuals to be part of growing the family business, of stewarding the family assets. If you want that kind of success, you really need to be focusing on how each individual feels, what they know. And this links into something I'm sure you've heard about, which is the need for balance between the we, the family as a whole and the business, and the individual, a balance with the I, the we and the I. And what I often say to families who have a certain amount of wealth is that they need to encourage the thinking that the more independent wealth that the younger generation can have at appropriate ages, the more the younger generation will be able to openly contribute to a long-term vision for the family business that is being stewarded. In other words, if you keep your children poor and you ask them, take care of this business for future generations, it's not going to work as well as where you have a model where the younger generation who are really contributing to the business can individually become wealthy in their own right, but at the same time they are discharging their responsibility to steward the family wealth and business. So these are super, interesting dynamics. And what's so interesting at the end of the day and sad is exactly as you said earlier on, for those who don't have a lot of wealth, there is this kind of envy of families who do have wealth. But when you really look under the curtains and you see what's going on within wealth owning and business owning families, there is a lot of misery and unhappiness and a lot of wasted assets and wasted opportunities.
That's a great argument what you are bringing in front of us. And just for our listeners and viewers, we will put just a link for Philip books in the show notes. And Philip, what I want to do at this stage in our conversation, I want to pick up your opinion. Your opinion, I mean, we are standing in front of it's just ongoing, these great wealth transfer. I mean, everybody is talking about this $100 trillion wealth transfer. For my imagination, in many cases, nobody actually knows what this actually means, right? And we have also, what we see in the future is that we will have just structure-wise other families. And these families in the future will be, by and large, nothing to do with the family structure from the past. And that brings me to my question, and you mentioned this early on, that 100 years as a family could be approached by your own lifetime, right? You can be the fourth generation and you can be still alive, because probably we will live longer, more than 100 years. And what I mean by this is just, what is your view on these 100-year family plan, just even better to transition this plan into a 1,000-year family plan? Should be this just ennoble a better approach for most of these entrepreneurial families, what we are seeing today?
Well, a couple of observations on what you've said. I think that, families, again, all too often don't even consider for what time period they're planning. Very often they're dealing with the immediacy and they put it off too late. They just have this expectation everything is going to work out somehow. And they may have done a really good job of planning the growth of the family business or whatever, but they're not very good at really thinking, how is this going to transition to the next generation? And we see that over and over in terms of the problems that we read about of families in succession. And nowadays, there are lawyers and others who profit from the disputes within families. And there are even lawyers today who work on contingency. In other words, they specialize, they don't charge the client for fighting within a big family. What they do is they have litigation funding where there are companies that fund the litigation and then they earn a piece of it. And you see one family after the other where the lack of planning has resulted in a complete disaster that benefits no one in the family, but benefits people outside of the family. So a lot of families don't even think of the 100 years that you mentioned or the 30 years that I mentioned earlier, let alone the 1,000 years that you just mentioned. What I think is a healthy approach is to have a planning that you do, and then when you do have a good planning for 30 years or 50 years or whatever it is you're shooting for, you can then begin to discuss and explore, okay, let's now talk longer term. Because if you're talking families with a really big, serious business worth, billions, employing, thousands of employees in different places, involved in a lot of different things, it really does make sense that you do need to start thinking more than just 50 years or 100 years. And there are some families moving into thinking, okay, what does this mean for our family 300 years from now, 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now? And it becomes very, very interesting discussion to get into that kind of conversation. Now, what does this mean when you start talking about planning 100 years, 300 years, 500 years? Well, coming back to the methodology, which I mentioned earlier about starting at the end, what it means is to say to yourself, okay, if we're planning for 1,000 years versus 100 years, what will our family look like in 1,000 years? Well, one of the things that I can tell you right now is it's going to be a lot bigger than it is today. You're going to have a lot of family members. And if you start working that out, you're going to start to realize that unless the family business is absolutely huge, there's no way that everyone in the family is going to benefit from that family business in any meaningful way. But maybe there are approaches that you can put in place to clarify, what do you get if you're a member of the family? Well, maybe if you're a member of the family and you meet the values of the family, you don't do anything that goes against the family constitution, you do everything the way you should, perhaps you get some assistance with education and healthcare. And that's it. That's all you get for being a family member. And then if you are participating in the stewardship of the engine of the family, and what do I mean by the engine? The engine is the mix of businesses and wealth management. It's all the assets that are being stewarded for the long term. If you are part of the group who have prepared themselves and you're playing leadership roles, you're on family boards, you're on the supervisory board, you're doing these things, then there are mechanisms designed to allow for an entrepreneurial return to those family members who do that. And there are families you can take as examples in Europe and elsewhere who do this. What they do is they have compensation plans where they say, okay, if you're qualified to work in the family business, then we lend you money to invest in the family business. And when you retire, we buy you out at the value at the time you retire. And by doing that, we are giving independent wealth to you and your own individual family, apart from the stewarded business assets that are the engine for the future of the family. So if you're thinking of those 1,000 years, you have to think about, who are family members, what are the entitlements, what is the governance going to be, and then you also again have to talk about all the same derailers, things that can go wrong and will go wrong over 1,000 years. That includes tax changes, political risk, expropriations, divorces, legal claims, all of these things that are the pitfalls for families. And there are, again, steps using trusts and foundations and partnerships and all of these things that can help navigate those things. But it's a dynamic conversation within families, and I'll tell you, and I'll end there with my comments, and you can ask me some other questions, but I'll tell you that some families that I've observed and that I've worked with who are serious about talking about 500 years and 1,000 years, they meet as a family. There's one family I work with, they meet as a family 4 times a year for 3 full days only on this topic, 4 times a year, because they see it as being the most important thing that the older generation, that's a family now, 3rd, 4th generation, they see it as their most important job is to lay the future of how these assets will transition to the next, not only the next generation, but to the next generations going forward. And there are many, many issues for all families when you're moving into this very, very long term. Just to give you another simple example, it's so common in families to divide things on a family branch basis. What does that mean? I'm mother and father. We have 3 kids, a daughter and 2 sons. We leave everything 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. As soon as you do that, you're creating a branch structure where if there's a family business in the picture, there will be an unevenness of ownership in the future. Because if one of those children has more children and another one has no children, you're going to have some family branches with many members. You're going to have some family branches with 1 or 2 members. You'll have some family branches with no members. And in the end, the family business is going to have unequal ownership and interests within the family. What some families do at an early stage is they move some of the elements of the family business and ownership into per capita ownership. So let's say we have stewarded business assets. What we may do is shift that away from branch ownership into individual per capita family member ownership. And we could put in place provisions, for example, to say the family business is not owned by anyone in the family. It's being stewarded for future generations. However, in every generation, we will allow for 1 or 2 generational harvests. In other words, where the family business will distribute some of its wealth to family members so that they will have individual wealth. But that distribution won't be on a branch basis. It'll be on a per capita basis. Any individual who is a family member. Lots of elements of thinking designed all to lead to the ultimate destination. We want to arrive at 1,000 years or 500 years as a happy family, a healthy family with a strong business and investment engine that is contributing not only to the family, but to employees, to the community, and to planet and our society.
In our last discussion with Jay Hughes, and I want to ask you about that, we asked the question about what is the family? I mean, who is part of the family? And Jay has this approach of saying a family is a congregation of people by affinity and not by blood. Because in a course of a couple of decades or even hundreds of years, you have a lot of people coming in, spouses, husbands, divorces, as you said before, changes in the family structure. So when does the question, who is family and what does family mean, takes place?
Well, the question of who is family takes place right at the outset. And, absolutely what Jay has said to you is correct. The term family is a very amorphous issue. It includes a lot of very important people. But the term comes up, right away for everyone when they're dealing with succession, because you not only have to deal with the obvious ones, things like, what about spouses, but you also have to deal with adopted children. and many other elements. I mean, there are families who, for cultural, religious, and other reasons, exclude adopted children. They may exclude illegitimate children. These are all elements that need to be within families discussed. And then the role of spouses is a very important and interesting one, because if you cut spouses out and they're not part of the family for the purposes of what the family is doing in their planning, in a way, coming back to what I said about the circular economy, you're wasting resources. Spouses may be very valuable resources that you're wasting, and families have limited resources. A spouse is parenting the next generation and is very, very important. The flip side is, if a spouse has too much information and then there's a breakup of the marriage, that may facilitate them going for a bigger grab of assets. So what's very important is to be very mindful about how you implement policies and approaches. And there may be some roles where spouses are involved. There may be other elements where spouses are not involved. So in a lot of families, you have, for example, a family assembly that may vote in the family council. Well, there's often no reason, if you've structured things well, that spouses shouldn't be part of a family assembly and be part of that voting. And the family council, which may have responsibilities for family-oriented decisions, could very well be made up of spouses. But perhaps other governance bodies, like a business council that is very directly involved in decisions on the assets of the family, maybe that's reserved only for bloodline family members. It's not the same rule that develops in every family, but what's important is to be very mindful and to discuss the approach within the families to get as much buy-in as possible, including from spouses. And there are many good examples around the world of situations where it actually has been spouses, the in-laws, that have driven the family business forward in a very positive way. And I can give a lot of examples of such families where that's occurred. And yet, you know, I work with a lot of families in Asia. I also work with a lot of families where they simply, you know, not only cut out any spouses, they even cut out their own daughters. They only go with the sons in the business. So there's no one magic, you know, approach, but there is one thing that absolutely is critical to success in my view, and that's having very good dialogue and preparation of that younger generation for the roles that they're going to take. What the parents often forget is it's not going to be them that make a success of the succession process. They're going to be dead. The ones who are going to make a success of the succession process are the next generation. And if they're not involved in the succession discussion and conversation, it's challenging to make it work.
So before we come to the end for today, Philip, I want to approach once again these kind of topic what we have discussed previous on these 100-year and 1,000-year family plan. And what I want to do is just to take a view on the other side of the coin. You mentioned this just also early on in regards of your book, what is coming in February, that we have the families on the one hand and we have the society on the other side. So my question to you is just, is it just requested for us as a society that we will see more and more families that they come together just as a tribe, that they have significance, that they have relevance? Yes, that they come up maybe with a solution for them that they will survive over the next 200 and 300 years. Could be this just in good groundwork for us as a society, and vice versa for the families itself?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot, there's a lot, you know, a lot of issues come up in some of the things that you've said. You know, let me start off by saying the sad reality of what families face in their planning is the families that will succeed, the 200, 300 years that you mentioned, the 1,000 years, the families that will succeed to do that are families that are able to navigate a reality that we're in a world that increasingly does not support wealth in business owners and does not respect them. We're in a world where, the issues of inequality, which are real issues of inequality that need to be dealt with, are increasingly political issues. It is with Schadenfreude that anybody looks at the problems of the wealthy, and there are more and more moves in taxation and otherwise to take away what the wealthy has to redistribute it. And there's not enough appreciation, in my view, that wealth and business owners are, for the most part, responsible wealth and business owners who work for the long term, and that benefits hugely society and communities and economies, but it's not well understood yet at all. And there's a lot of chop and change. So the families that are going to make it for 300 years are the ones who are very nimble, who understand that for the time being, while there are moves to the contrary, each country still offers a different experience from a tax point of view, a legal protection point of view, and otherwise. And families that have flexibility in terms of people being able to move from one place to another, assets being moved into different jurisdictions, diversifying the ownership into different structures, those are the families that will survive, over these many generations, and which in turn will benefit society over many, many generations, but not necessarily because society has worked really well hand in hand with them. There are some places in the world where there is an alignment to some extent between the governments and the interests of wealth and business owners, but they're few and far between. But there are a few countries in the world. Singapore would be an example that comes to mind, but there are others where there is a good, direction of where all of this is going. And then the other comment that I would make on your 100 years and 1,000 years is planning only for 50 years or 100 years is not necessarily a bad thing. You don't have to, in my view, deal with 1,000-year planning, because if you do everything well, you're putting confidence in the governance that you've put in place that the right decisions will be made at the right time. You cannot predict where the world is going to go in 1,000 years. It's good to dream about it a little bit, but what's even more important is to make sure that in the 50 years or the 100 years or the 30 years, in the shorter term, let's call it, you've really put in place everything you can to make sure decision-making within the family can be well done going forward. And you can learn so much from the mistakes, the many mistakes that have been made by families. And what I see over and over are these mistakes that destroy what the family was trying to achieve.
Great.
As we wrap up, Philip, one question maybe that the listeners or the viewers today were sparked by the idea of this 50-year, 100-year, 500-year, 1,000-year family. How would you start a process like this? What's your advice that you would give them?
The most important issue for families as a whole is, as I've mentioned, is dialogue. Having conversations about, this future. And how they start is with a dialogue that will involve the younger generation at a certain point. Clearly, the older generation, you may be dealing with, one family, you may be dealing with multiple families because maybe there are siblings involved, but maybe the older generation gets together first and says, look, we want to embark on a process where we start thinking about our long-term future of the family and what we're trying to achieve. Why are we running so fast? What are we really trying to achieve? It's all about dialogue. And then the family moves into having family retreats, meetings within the family that are well structured with agendas and with good approaches to encourage the family to begin discussing, okay, where do we all agree we want to go? What are we trying to achieve together as a family in terms of our, we're lucky enough to have some wealth and business. How can we turn this into an engine that is going to create success for our family and for our communities? And do we care about our communities? That should be part of the conversation too. Can the family survive if the planet doesn't survive? I don't think so, but some families think they can. And, so but it's the dialogue and having clarity in meetings and the approaches that are being taken. And in my book, one of the things that I do is, I go through that planning process that I mentioned, but I then mention in quite a lot of detail what are the steps that you need to take on the way to reaching your ultimate goal. And so to reach that 1,000 years, there are a number of things the family needs to do. They need to, create agendas of family meetings. They need to make sure that they have captured the family values, the family history. They need to listen to the different views of different family members. When I personally work with families, I never only have meetings with the family as a whole. I interview individually each family member, including each member of the younger generation, because that's how I start to find out what's really going on in this family and what are the issues in the family. It's only in those individual meetings you start hearing about, the negatives of the personality of the mother and the father and the things that they do and all the usual issues about in-laws and problems and all of that. And the role of the advisor is to then, take all this information and to try to help guide the family in the right direction.
So that was a wonderful discussion with you, Philip. And before we jump out, I will just test on your side what you called the theory of change. And what I mean by this is just as my closing question, and this question we will ask each of our attendees in the call. Can you imagine we will invite you on this day, what we have met us today, in 500 years from now? What is actually, if we start from the end, what will be your expectation? What will be your wishes? What we will see in 500 years from now if you look back on families, on the society, and also on this topic, wealth?
Well, I guess myself, I do believe that unless there's a respect and understanding that grows of the value of family business and wealth owners and their role in society, unless there is an appreciation of that, I'm afraid that in 500 years there may be very few wealth and business owning families because governments will have taken away their wealth and their businesses with a view to addressing perceived issues in and around inequality and otherwise as being solvable in that way. We would then be in the hands of governments that think very short term. There are some governments that think a bit longer term, but the reality is governments around the world think very short term, election to election. We see it around the world. I don't have to mention, the US and elsewhere. And these short term decisions will lead to a world that may not survive. Full stop. Climate change and other challenges. However, what I would see as success in 500 years is if families in business have managed to work with governments hand in hand to address income and wealth inequality, to help show that because families have long-term visions themselves and they think in a different way than publicly listed companies that are just looking at quarterly earnings, because family businesses think long-term, because family businesses are aligned with supporting societies, that will lead to families that survive for 500 years, businesses that survive for 500 years, but also a planet and a world that will survive for many, many hundreds of years going forward. So that's what I'd like to see in 500 years.
Absolutely amazing. That's great. So
thank you very much, Philip, for your closing words. It was really amazing to have you on the podcast. Thank you very much for your wisdom. Jan, you want to share something from your side? I'm so...
It was mind-blowing, Philip, and I've enjoyed the time with you, and hopefully we can talk once again. Many, many thanks.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for tuning in to C100 Global Wisdom Talks. If you found today's conversation valuable, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others who might benefit. For more resources and insights, visit www.cu100global.com.